We're going to dive deep into Joe Rogan's interview with Michael Pollan and what Michael Pollan had to say about caffeine and how athletes can actually benefit from getting off of caffeine. And we're going to start right now. What's up, everybody? It's Dane Miller from GarageStrength.com. And if this is your first time to the channel and you're interested in becoming a better athlete, you're interested in being a little bit more introspective into how you can improve sports performance, make sure that you like, you subscribe, and you ring that notification bell so we can help you become a beast. Okay, so Joe Rogan had Michael Pollan on his podcast about a week ago, and they went into Michael Pollan's approach to getting off of caffeine and how it completely opened up his mindset and how it helped him, potentially be a better person after the adaptation phase of getting off caffeine occurred. And so how does this have to impact strength and sports performance? And I think we're going to go deep into a couple of those different topics as far as what would it do for an athlete to get off of caffeine, to get off of that stimulant. But before we dive into that, we've got to know, who is Michael Pollan? So he is someone who has a genuine interest in botany, in plants, and in agriculture. And in the past, early on in his career, he was one of the first guys writing a lot of gardener type books early on, but then he wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma, which was probably like his huge breakthrough. He had a couple books prior to that were popular, but The Omnivore's Dilemma really brought light to sustainable agriculture, to permaculture, putting someone like Joel Salatin under the microscope, seeing what Joel Salatin does with permaculture and how he effectively farms with animals and utilizes this system for a more effective farming system versus having factory farms and genetically modified organisms or GMOs. And that's what really brought him into that spotlight, was he was challenging GMOs and factory farming. And so now he's coming out with a new book, This Is Your Mind on Plants, and he's going into psychoactive drugs and including drugs like caffeine and what caffeine can do for people. So he starts to discuss a couple unique factors around caffeine, and we're going to go into that right now.
What I'm trying to do with This Is Your Mind on Plants is start that post-drug war conversation about drugs, which is one of the reasons I included caffeine, a totally legal drug that everybody uses. What does that have to teach us? In a way, one of the most powerful drug experiences I've had in my life was the first cup of coffee after 3 months off.
Really?
It was psychedelic. It
Really?
was incredible. Yeah.
Come on.
Try it. Try getting off caffeine for a
3
while.
months?
3 months without caffeine.
How am I going to do a podcast?
You may have to take a hiatus.
I'm going to run out of things to talk about. I'll fall asleep.
It was really hard. I did it actually at the suggestion of Roland Griffith, who, the psychedelic researcher, who before that was the world's leading expert on caffeine. And that's not a bad thing, but I think we have a debt to these plants that we owe them. And so I spent a lot of time in that researching that chapter, looking back in history for when caffeine enters the West. And it doesn't happen until the 1650s in Europe. So we actually have a before and after, which we don't with a lot of drugs because they just go back, millennia.
I think this is a really interesting part, and I believe that when you start to look at compounds and drugs, as Pollan has pointed out, and other various aspects, foods, how it can directly impact culture. And so he goes into, caffeine really wasn't discovered until the late 800s, sort of accidentally by a livestock farmer who noticed that I think his goats were starting to get a little antsy and stuff after they were eating a specific bean. I believe this was a coffee bean. But it didn't enter the West until around the 1650s and into Europe. And so you can sort of see what ends up happening, and he touches on this. There was Arab math development was very likely guided or led by caffeine and what caffeine can do for people mentally. And then also he even brings up the Enlightenment and how caffeine can lead to this euphoric motivation, and then how in the same decade, in the 1650s, Europe was exposed to chocolate, which has caffeine, to coffee, and to teas, which plants will create the compound of caffeine to sort of almost like fend off other plants that might be invasive, or potentially even other animals, to get them to not consume them, to not eat them. And so Michael Pollan does a really good job of questioning a lot of things and bringing a lot of discussion to come out and say, that the Enlightenment was essentially triggered by coffee. I don't know if it would be that simple to analyze it from that perspective. Sure, it might have played a big role, but there's a lot of moving pieces that would lead to enlightenment. But again, I think as he talks about caffeine's role, we've got to think about it from a strength perspective, and comparing it with normal people who might be developing more logic and more reason, and how people started to drink more coffee and more tea instead of drinking so much. So a lot of people, and there's actually a book in the United States about the United States called The Alcoholic Republic. So in the US, based off of this book, and I've read this book twice, I haven't read it in a couple years, but I believe we were drinking on average like 8 gallons of straight grain liquor a year. If we would sort of sift everything down to even the beer and the mead and the wine, if you looked at it from a straight alcoholic consumption, it was like 8 gallons in a year. Something absurd. Whereas today, in today's world, the average is about 1.5 gallons, right? So it's significantly lower. But people would drink tons and tons of alcohol. They would essentially be buzzed the entire day. Alcohol and fermentation processes can decrease the amount of pathogens that are going to be in water. But what ends up happening is, because we would heat water to make coffee or make tea, now that process is going to create that stimulant and that caffeine. And so that leads to a unique way of changing a society from being essentially a drunk society to becoming more aware. And even as Pollan points out in this, even in the United States, this happened all the way up through the Industrial Revolution. And then once the Industrial Revolution occurs, people start to utilize caffeine a little bit more, and they have to, because they start to specialize a little bit more in their trade. So they have to have a little bit more precise work. So it's a lot more effective to be stimulated than it is to be drunk. So this is essentially the main argument. Now, what does this have to do with sports? If we can think about technique and becoming a better sportsman, you have to be technical. You have to understand and make various reads. If you're in a field sport, you have to understand technique and strength and mobility and all these different facets, and controlling your brain. If you're utilizing caffeine or a stimulant, you're going to be able to process things a little bit quicker. You're going to have a higher pain tolerance. You're going to be in a greater mindset. Whereas if you remove that from your strength training or from your sport-based training, it's not going to be as effective. And so what we've got to think about when Pollan goes into all this is that how can we utilize this from a strength perspective? And I think that if you look at it from like a 16-week block period, if we start to think about periodization, and we use the parabolic periodization model here at Garage Strength, and the parabolic periodization model is a 16-week model. And we've got to think about 16 to 20 weeks. When could we have strength athletes like Olympic weightlifters or wrestlers or even swimmers to a point, or shot putters, football players, go off caffeine? And so if we would do this experiment, I do think you could take about a month or 2 off from caffeine if you wanted to play this experimental game. Take 2 to 3 months off if you are 20 weeks out from a competition, from a peak. So those first 8 to 12 weeks, you might just be focusing on very specific strength work. And when someone does come off of caffeine, there's a dependency issue. There's a period of being in a fog, being in a haze. And so if you're an athlete who wants to do this, you've got to make sure that your sleep regimen is extremely precise. So if you want to take caffeine and take coffee out of it, take stimulants out of it, even Adderall, take all that out of it, we have to set up a training system that is extremely focused on your sleep quality. So that means getting blackout curtains or sleeping in a basement that has no windows, so that can optimize your sleep schedule. So you get into this early on, you might be sleeping for 12 to 14 hours. As you get less and less dependent on caffeine, that might go to 8 to 10 hours of sleep. So now you're going to be slowly recovering a little bit more effectively as you get off of caffeine. And then the next step would be, you're not going to put out as much power. Your pain tolerance isn't going to be as good. So you have to be more focused on your technical movement. And to do that without being stimulated by caffeine or coffee, you have to focus a little more. You have to increase your overall awareness towards your surroundings. So you've got to be a little bit more focused on what you're doing. And I think that's where what will come into play is that currently in our world of training, we're stimulated by everything. We're stimulated by YouTube, we're stimulated by Instagram, we're stimulated by TV, we're stimulated by all these different moving pieces. But to get off of caffeine, you've got to figure out, how can I get all these distractions out? Because what ends up happening is, as you're training, and if you're not focused with caffeine, you're gonna have all these outside things and thoughts coming into you. But if you're dry from caffeine, you can use that as a period to increase your mental capacity. You can use that as a period to increase, your cognitive behavior. You can use this as a means of increasing your meditative state, and as a means of finding those skills to enter into the flow state. So now, as a strength coach, I see this, and I see this discussion with Pollan and with Joe Rogan as an opportunity for athletes to take caffeine, to take coffee, to take pre-workout out of the equation. And they go on with Joe Rogan, and as he brings in coffee and he has this euphoric response. And I do believe that a lot of people have had this when they use caffeine for the first time, or if they decrease their caffeine intake and then bring it back up. You might have a huge lift where you go and you lift, and all of a sudden you train really well because you're fully caffeinated. So I think how we could use this as strength coaches and as athletes then is that if we go through a 2-month dry period or a 3-month dry period from caffeine, and we're focused on sleep, we're focused on recovery, we're focused on the cognitive behavior, over time as we bring it in, we can say, and this is what Pollan brings up, is that, all right, let's just have it on a Saturday. So for us, if we have a big lift on a Friday, let's just do it on a Friday. Or let's just do it on a Sunday. For my throwers, we usually have our biggest throw session on a Sunday. So now maybe you just use caffeine every Sunday. But what I believe is more effective for athletes is to say, okay, on days that we are going to be lifting heavy or competing heavy in our own specific sport in training, let's do 2 to 3 days where we have 300 to 500 milligrams, depending on your body weight, but 300 to 400 milligrams maybe 3 days a week. And then those other days we come off of caffeine, or we just have about 80 to 100 milligrams. And what ends up occurring then is you feel the potency more from the stimulation of caffeine. And because you've done that better work on your sleep recovery and on your sleep hygiene and on your cognitive behavior, now you get more effective at blocking out distractions, so that when you're stimulated, it's really in this narrow mindset. And I think that that's a really important concept to understand, is that if you talk to somebody who uses Adderall who doesn't have a prescription for it, they always will say, dude, it's like 8 hours straight of taking coffee or taking caffeine and being in this like go mindset. Now it's different if you need that prescription, but if you aren't prescribed Adderall and you use it, it's extremely potent. And that's why a lot of guys in technical sports will try to get TUEs for Adderall. And if we can take that step back as coaches, and instead of looking for that TUE, now we just use that caffeine as that. It's something that I believe Rogan and Pollan bring up a really, really good idea. And I think that this is something that people can do as athletes. They can learn from the scientific world. We can learn from the mathematical world. We can learn from research and use it effectively, so that later on our peak is even greater, because of where we've gone with our behavior, with our cognitive behavior development, and where we've gone with our overall stimulation and focus on technique. So I believe it's a great idea, and I would recommend anyone, go a week without having caffeine. But if you're gonna go a week without having caffeine, set a goal, set a guideline, set a plan of where you wanna be, and recognize that if you're a strength athlete, your weights are going to be diminishing. You're not going to be as strong. And you also need to be aware of where that caffeine is sourced from then, so that you don't have your chocolate. You don't have, a random drink that might have a couple milligrams of caffeine in it. Kombucha, something like that. A lot of people don't realize does have some caffeine. So start at a week, see how you make progress. Maybe you sit there and you say, my goal is to go an entire month, but recognize you're gonna have to sleep a lot more early on. You're gonna need a nap most likely for that first week every single day, which is also a healthy aspect behind getting off of caffeine. And then have a plan for slowly introducing that back into your training, so that then you can take full advantage of that stimulation, and that's gonna help you recognize a huge benefit, which could, if you run this experiment, lead to massive results in your overall performance. So if you need help with that, head over to GarageStrength.com. You can pick up a nutrition program, and you can email us specifically at GarageStrength that you want a nutrition program without any caffeine in it to help you with this 1 month experiment. We can see how your weights progress. We can see how your mindset progresses. There's gonna be a lot of struggle early on, but over time, as you bring it back in, you're gonna see some really cool things happen with your weights, with your focus and training, and that in turn, ideally, could lead to greater growth as an athlete and as an individual. So if you need help with that, click on the link down below, head over to GarageStrength.com, and if you want more information about sports performance, click on this card right here. Until next time, guys, peace.